Sarah Martinez had always been different from the other kids in her small Texas town. While most girls her age were obsessing over makeup and boys, she spent her afternoons at the local gym, pushing herself through grueling workouts that would make grown men quit. Her father, a retired Marine, had taught her that strength wasn't just about muscles, it was about mental toughness, discipline, and never backing down from a challenge. At 17, Sarah stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, with a lean frame that made her appear almost fragile. Her long, dark hair was usually pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she preferred jeans and t-shirts over the trendy clothes her classmates wore. This made her an easy target for the popular crowd at Jefferson High School, who saw her as nothing more than a weird tomboy who didn't know her place. The harassment started small. Whispered comments in the hallways about how she looked like a boy, how she'd never get a boyfriend, how she was wasting her time trying to be something she wasn't. Sarah ignored it all, focusing instead on her studies and her training. She had bigger dreams than staying in this small town forever, dreams that required her to be stronger than the petty cruelty of teenagers. But as senior year approached, the bullying escalated. The ringleader was Madison Cole, a blonde cheerleader whose father owned the largest car dealership in town. Madison had everything: money, popularity, the quarterback boyfriend. But for some reason, she couldn't stand that Sarah refused to bow down to her social hierarchy. She made it her personal mission to make Sarah's life miserable. Madison's crew included her boyfriend Jake, a hulking football player who thought his Letterman jacket made him invincible, and her best friend Ashley, whose sharp tongue could cut deeper than any knife. Together, they formed a toxic triangle that ruled the school through fear and social manipulation. Teachers turned a blind eye because these kids came from influential families that donated generously to the school and could make careers disappear with a phone call. The attacks on Sarah became more personal and more public. They would accidentally bump into her in the hallways, causing her to drop her books. They spread rumors about her family's financial struggles. After her father's disability pension wasn't enough to cover all the bills, they mocked her secondhand clothes and her beat-up car, a 15-year-old Honda Civic that had seen better days. Sarah's younger brother, Tommy, was a freshman who looked up to his sister more than anyone in the world. He had inherited their father's gentle nature and their mother's artistic soul, making him an easy target for bullies as well. When Madison's crew started targeting Tommy as a way to get to Sarah, something inside her began to change. She could handle their attacks on her, but watching her little brother's spirit slowly break was more than she could bear. The worst incident happened on a Tuesday in October. Tommy had been working on an art project for weeks, a detailed painting of their grandfather who had died in Vietnam. It meant everything to him, and he'd planned to give it to their father as a surprise for his birthday. During lunch, Jake and his friends cornered Tommy in the art room and destroyed the painting, tearing it to shreds, while laughing about how worthless his family was. When Sarah found Tommy crying in the bathroom afterward, holding the ruined pieces of his artwork, she felt a rage unlike anything she'd ever experienced. But she also knew that responding with violence would only make things worse for both of them. Instead, she helped Tommy clean up and promised him that things would get better. She didn't know how, but she would find a way to protect her brother and end this nightmare. That evening, Sarah sat in her room, staring at a letter that had arrived the previous week. It was an acceptance letter to a prestigious college with a full scholarship, something she'd worked toward for years. The scholarship was her ticket out of this town, her chance to build a better life for herself and eventually for her family. But leaving would mean abandoning Tommy to face the bullies alone, and that was a choice she couldn't make. Her father knocked on her door around midnight. Despite his injuries from his military service, he still carried himself with the bearing of a Marine. He'd noticed the change in both his children over the past few months, the way they'd become quieter, more withdrawn. He'd fought in 2 tours overseas, but watching his children suffer in their own hometown was breaking his heart in ways that combat never could. They talked for hours that night about courage and standing up for what's right, about the difference between being strong and being smart. Her father told her stories about his time in the military, about the bonds between soldiers and how they never left anyone behind. He didn't give her advice directly, but Sarah understood the message. Sometimes you have to fight, but you had to choose your battles wisely and make sure you had the right allies. The next day at school, the harassment continued with renewed intensity. Madison had heard rumors about Sarah's college acceptance and was determined to tear her down before she could escape their small-town prison. During chemistry class, she deliberately knocked over Sarah's experiment, causing her to fail an important lab that would affect her final grade. When Sarah tried to explain to the teacher what had happened, Madison played innocent, and the teacher, who coached the cheerleading squad, took Madison's side. At lunch, the confrontation escalated further. Madison and her crew surrounded Sarah's table, making loud comments about how some people thought they were better than everyone else, how they forgot where they came from and who they really were. Other students watched nervously, some filming with their phones, but no one intervened. This was the social order of Jefferson High, and everyone knew their place. Sarah remained calm, continuing to eat her sandwich and read her book as if nothing was happening. This only infuriated Madison more. She grabbed Sarah's book and threw it across the cafeteria, then knocked her lunch tray to the floor. The mess splattered across Sarah's clothes and backpack, ruining her homework and the few good clothes she owned. Still, Sarah didn't react. She simply began cleaning up the mess while Madison's laughter echoed through the cafeteria. But inside, she was making calculations, planning her next move. She'd learned patience from her father, strategy from years of studying military history, and she understood that the best warriors choose when and where to fight. This wasn't the time or place, but that time was coming soon. After school, Sarah drove to the local community center where she volunteered teaching self-defense classes to younger kids. It was something she'd started the previous year, partly to help other children avoid becoming victims, but also because it helped her process her own anger and frustration. The kids adored her, and she found peace in their innocent enthusiasm and trust. As she was leaving the community center that evening, she noticed a black SUV with government plates parked across the street. The windows were tinted, but she could sense someone watching her. It wasn't the first time she'd noticed the vehicle. It had appeared several times over the past few weeks, always at a distance, always watching. Most people might have been frightened, but Sarah's instincts told her this wasn't a threat. If anything, it felt like protection. That night, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message was simple. Some battles require backup. Help is closer than you think. Sarah stared at the message for a long time, wondering who could have sent it and what it meant. She'd never asked for help, had always prided herself on being independent and strong enough to handle her own problems. But maybe it was time to accept that some fights were too big to face alone. The harassment at school continued to escalate throughout the week. Madison's attacks became more vicious and personal, targeting not just Sarah but her entire family. She spread rumors about her father's military service, claiming he'd been discharged dishonorably and that the family was living on welfare. She mocked her mother's job as a night shift nurse, suggesting that the family was too poor and trashy to belong in their community. Each attack was designed to isolate Sarah further, to make her feel worthless and powerless. Madison had perfected the art of psychological warfare, knowing exactly which buttons to push to cause maximum damage while maintaining plausible deniability. She was careful never to cross lines that would bring serious consequences, always staying just within the bounds of what adults would dismiss as typical teenage drama. But Madison had made one crucial miscalculation. She assumed that Sarah was alone, that she had no one to turn to, and no resources beyond what was visible on the surface. She saw a poor girl from a struggling military family and assumed that meant Sarah was helpless. What Madison didn't know was that Sarah's father had served alongside some of the most elite warriors in the American military, men who had sworn oaths that extended far beyond their active duty service. The bonds forged in combat never truly break, and when one of their own is threatened, the brotherhood responds. Sarah didn't know it yet, but her father had made some phone calls, reaching out to old friends who had never forgotten their debt to the man who'd saved their lives overseas. Help was indeed closer than she thought, and it was about to arrive in a way that would change everything at Jefferson High School forever. The turning point came on a Friday morning when Sarah arrived at school to find her locker vandalized with cruel graffiti. Words like worthless, trash, and worse had been spray-painted across the metal surface in bright red letters. The janitor was already working to clean it off, shaking his head with disgust at what teenagers could do to each other. Other students walked by, some snickering, others looking uncomfortable but unwilling to get involved. Sarah stood there for a moment, staring at the hateful words, feeling something shift inside her. This wasn't just about her anymore. Madison and her crew had declared war, and they'd chosen to fight dirty, but they had no idea what they were really up against, or who they were actually challenging when they targeted a Marine's daughter. During first period, Sarah received a note to report to the principal's office. She found Principal Harrison, a weak man who'd held his position for 20 years. By avoiding conflict and keeping wealthy parents happy, sitting behind his desk looking uncomfortable, Madison and her mother, Mrs. Surratt Cole, were already there, both wearing expressions of false concern and manufactured victimhood. Mrs. Cole was a perfectly manicured woman who wore her wealth like armor and her influence like a weapon. She'd been the one to suggest this meeting, claiming that Sarah had been harassing her daughter and making threats. She had no evidence, of course, but she didn't need any. In this town, her family's money spoke louder than truth, and she was used to getting her way through intimidation and political connections. Madison sat beside her mother, playing the role of frightened victim with practiced skill. She claimed that Sarah had been following her around school, making threatening gestures, and creating a hostile environment. She even managed to produce a few tears, talking about how scared she was to come to school because of Sarah's unstable behavior and violent tendencies. Principal Harrison listened to their fabricated story with the kind of attention he reserved for people who could affect his job security. He barely glanced at Sarah as she sat quietly, waiting for her chance to respond. When Mrs. Cole finished her performance, demanding that something be done immediately to protect her daughter, the principal turned to Sarah with a look of resignation. Sarah was given exactly 3 minutes to defend herself against accusations that everyone in the room knew were false. She spoke calmly and clearly, explaining the real situation, how Madison and her friends had been systematically bullying her and her brother for months, how they'd destroyed Tommy's artwork, how they'd spread lies about her family. She even offered to provide witnesses and evidence of the harassment. But her words fell on deaf ears. Mrs. Cole interrupted her repeatedly, calling her a liar and demanding that action be taken immediately. She threatened to go to the school board, to the media, to anyone who would listen if her daughter wasn't protected from this dangerous student. Principal Harrison, faced with a choice between doing what was right and protecting his career, chose the path of least resistance. Sarah was given a week's suspension for making threats against another student and creating a hostile environment. She was also banned from participating in any school activities for the remainder of the semester, effectively ending her involvement in the academic clubs and volunteer programs that had been building her college resume. The injustice of it all was staggering, but not surprising to anyone who understood how power really worked in their small town. As Sarah cleaned out her locker under the watchful eyes of the assistant principal, Madison walked by with her crew, no longer bothering to hide their satisfaction. They'd won, or so they thought. They'd successfully used the system against their victim, turning Sarah's refusal to be broken into evidence of her guilt. It was a masterful manipulation that would have impressed professional con artists. But Madison made the mistake of gloating too loudly. As Sarah gathered her belongings, she heard Madison bragging to her friends about how easy it had been to get rid of that freak, and how maybe now her retard brother would learn his place too. It was the mention of Tommy that pushed Sarah past her breaking point. For the first time in months, she turned to face her tormentors directly. The confrontation that followed was brief but intense. Sarah didn't raise her voice or make any threats, but something in her eyes made Madison take a step back. Sarah simply told them that their games had consequences, that actions had reactions, and that they might want to think carefully about what they'd started. Then she walked away, leaving behind a group of bullies who suddenly felt less confident about their victory. That afternoon, as Sarah drove home past the community center, she noticed the black SUV again. This time, it wasn't hiding. It was parked directly in front of the building, and a man in civilian clothes was standing beside it. He was tall and lean, with the kind of bearing that screamed military, even without a uniform. When he saw Sarah's car, he nodded slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement and respect that spoke volumes. At home, Sarah found her father waiting for her in the garage, working on his old motorcycle with the kind of focused intensity he brought to everything. He'd heard about the suspension from the school's automated call system, but he didn't ask for details immediately. Instead, he handed her a wrench, and they worked together in comfortable silence for almost an hour before he spoke. When he finally did talk, it wasn't about the unfairness of her situation or the corruption of the school system. Instead, he told her a story about his time in Afghanistan, about a mission that had gone wrong when local officials had been bought off by enemy forces. His unit had found themselves betrayed by the very people they'd been trying to protect, facing an impossible situation with no support from the chain of command. The story had a point, though he never stated it directly. Sometimes the system fails, sometimes the people in charge are corrupt or cowardly, and sometimes good people have to find other ways to fight back. But the key was having the right allies, people who understood honor and loyalty and who would stand by you when everything else fell apart. Those bonds, forged in the crucible of shared struggle, were stronger than any official authority. That evening, Sarah's phone rang with a call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was calm and professional, identifying himself only as a friend of her father's. He wanted to meet with her the next day to discuss her situation and explore some options that might be available. The meeting would be at the community center, where they could talk privately without drawing attention. Sarah spent that night thinking about everything that had happened, everything she'd lost, and everything she still had to protect. The suspension was just the beginning. Madison and her family would keep pushing until they'd destroyed Sarah's chances for college, her brother's safety, and her family's reputation in the community. They had money, influence, and a system that protected people like them while grinding down people like the Martinez family. But they'd also made a crucial error in judgment. They'd assumed that being poor meant being powerless, that coming from a military family meant having no connections, that a teenage girl had no resources beyond what they could see on the surface. They'd looked at Sarah and seen someone worth nothing, someone who could be crushed without consequences. What they didn't understand was that she came from a world where loyalty meant everything and no one ever fought alone. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the community center to find 3 men waiting for her in a small conference room. They were dressed in casual clothes, but everything about them, their posture, their awareness, their quiet confidence, marked them as military. The man who'd called her introduced himself as Chief Petty Officer Mike Rodriguez, though he was currently on leave from active duty. With him were 2 other men who didn't give their ranks or full names, introducing themselves simply as Sam and Marcus. All 3 had served with her father in various capacities over the years, and all 3 owed him their lives. When word had reached them about the situation his daughter was facing, they'd requested leave to come and assess the problem personally. What followed was a conversation unlike any Sarah had ever experienced. These men listened to her story with the kind of professional attention they might give to a mission briefing. They asked detailed questions about the school's power structure, the key players involved, their motivations and vulnerabilities. They wanted to understand the battlefield completely before making any moves. Sarah learned that they'd already been conducting their own investigation for the past 2 weeks, ever since her father had reached out to his old contacts. They'd done background checks on Madison's family, researched the school board members and their connections, and identified every point of leverage and weakness in the local power structure. What they'd found had surprised even them. Madison's father, Robert Cole, had built his car dealership empire through a combination of legitimate business and creative financial arrangements. His family's wealth was real, but it was also precarious, built on loans and leveraged deals that could collapse if the right pressure was applied. More importantly, his business depended heavily on military contracts and relationships with local defense contractors. Cole's influence in the community came largely from her position on various charity boards and social organizations, but her power was entirely social and reputational. She had no real political connections beyond what her husband's money could buy. She was used to intimidating people through bluster and threats, but she'd never faced opposition from people who couldn't be bought, fired, or socially ostracized. Principal Harrison's weakness was even more obvious. He'd been covering up various administrative problems at the school for years, including misuse of federal education funds and discrimination complaints that had been buried rather than properly investigated. He lived in constant fear that his incompetence would be exposed, making him easy to manipulate by anyone who knew where the bodies were buried. But the most important discovery was something that would change the entire dynamic of the situation. Madison herself had secrets that her family didn't know about. habits and associations that would horrify her image-conscious parents and destroy her carefully constructed reputation. She'd assumed that her family's money made her untouchable, but she'd also made choices that left her vulnerable to exposure. Chief Rodriguez explained that they had multiple options for dealing with the situation, ranging from subtle pressure to overwhelming force. But before they moved forward, they wanted Sarah to understand something important. Once they got involved, there would be no going back. The bullies wouldn't just stop. They would be stopped permanently and completely. But that level of intervention came with responsibilities and consequences that she needed to consider carefully. Sarah thought about her brother, still going to school every day in fear. She thought about her father, a decorated veteran, being disrespected by people who'd never served anything but their own interests. She thought about all the other kids who might become targets if Madison's crew was allowed to continue their reign of terror unopposed. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. She looked each of the men in the eye and told them she was ready for whatever came next. Chief Rodriguez smiled for the first time since they'd met, and Sarah understood that she'd just enlisted allies who would never abandon the fight. Madison Cole and her family had wanted to play power games with a Marine's daughter, and now they were about to learn the difference between having money and having true strength. The operation began on Monday morning while Sarah was still officially suspended from school. Chief Rodriguez and his team had spent the weekend putting all the pieces in place, making phone calls to people who owed favors, gathering evidence, and preparing what they called a comprehensive response strategy. They worked with the precision and thoroughness that had kept them alive through multiple combat deployments, treating this mission with the same seriousness they'd given to operations in hostile territory. The first move was subtle but devastating. Robert Cole arrived at his dealership to find two men in expensive suits waiting in his office, representing what they claimed was a consortium of military contractors interested in expanding their vehicle procurement in the region. They asked detailed questions about his business practices, his financial arrangements, and his family's involvement in community affairs. The questions seemed innocent enough, but Cole was smart enough to realize he was being evaluated for something much more significant than a simple business deal. What Robert Cole didn't know was that these contractors were actually retired military intelligence officers who specialized in corporate investigation and security consulting. They had no interest in buying cars, but they were very interested in the kind of man who would allow his daughter to destroy other families while hiding behind wealth and influence. Their questions were designed to make him understand that his business empire wasn't as secure as he'd believed. Meanwhile, Mrs. Cole received a surprise visit from representatives of the state education department, conducting what they called a routine review of the local school district's compliance with federal anti-bullying and discrimination policies. They'd received anonymous complaints about systematic harassment of military families and wanted to interview school board members about their oversight responsibilities. Mrs. Cole quickly realized that her position on the school board was about to become a liability rather than an asset. At Jefferson High School, Principal Harrison found himself facing his worst nightmare. A team of federal education auditors had arrived unannounced to conduct a comprehensive review of the school's disciplinary procedures, financial records, and compliance with various federal mandates. They'd somehow obtained detailed records of every suspension, every complaint, and every administrative decision made over the past 5 years. The pattern of favoritism and discrimination was impossible to hide when examined by professionals who knew what to look for. But the most elegant part of the operation was what happened to Madison herself. She arrived at school that morning to find herself suddenly isolated from her usual crew. Jake had been benched from the football team, pending an investigation into steroid use, evidence of which had mysteriously appeared in his locker during a surprise drug search. Ashley discovered that the private social media accounts where she'd posted her cruelest commentary about other students had been forwarded to her strict religious parents, who were horrified to learn about their daughter's secret life. Madison tried to maintain her composure, but she could feel her carefully constructed world beginning to crumble around her. Other students sensed the shift in power dynamics and began distancing themselves from her, unwilling to be associated with someone whose protection was clearly evaporating. For the first time in her life, Madison experienced what it felt like to be truly alone and vulnerable. in the social ecosystem she'd once ruled. The investigation into Madison's own activities had uncovered a web of secrets that would have destroyed her family's reputation if exposed publicly. She'd been involved with older men from the nearby military base, accepting gifts and money in exchange for information about her father's business dealings and military contracts. She'd also been dealing prescription medications to other students, using her mother's connections in the medical community to obtain drugs that she sold for profit and social control. Chief Rodriguez had presented this evidence to Madison privately, not as a threat, but as an education about consequences. He explained that her actions had already crossed several federal laws, including those related to military security and controlled substances. Her age might protect her from the worst legal consequences, but the social and familial destruction would be total and permanent. He offered her a choice: immediate and complete cessation of all harassment activities or full exposure of everything they'd discovered. Madison had never encountered someone who couldn't be manipulated, bought, or intimidated. Chief Rodriguez spoke to her with the calm authority of someone who'd faced real enemies in real battles, and she understood instinctively that he was utterly immune to her usual tactics. She could threaten to call her parents, the police, or anyone else she wanted. He had documentation for everything, backing from people she'd never heard of, and the kind of patience that came from years of military training. By Tuesday, the entire power structure at Jefferson High School was in chaos. Principal Harrison was frantically trying to explain years of questionable decisions to federal auditors who showed no interest in his excuses or justifications. The school board was demanding answers about discrimination complaints that had been buried, and local media was beginning to pick up on the story of federal investigations at the town's primary high school. Robert Cole discovered that several of his major business contracts were suddenly under review, with military procurement officers expressing concerns about ethical standards and community leadership responsibilities. His bank began asking uncomfortable questions about loan payments and collateral requirements, suggesting that his financial situation was less stable than he'd publicly claimed. The business empire he'd built over decades was being systematically examined by people who had both the authority and the motivation to find problems. Mrs. Cole found herself facing social isolation for the first time in her adult life. Other members of her charity boards and social organizations were distancing themselves from her as rumors spread about federal investigations and family scandals. The power she'd wielded through gossip and social manipulation was turned against her, as former friends competed to demonstrate their disapproval of her family's behavior. But the most dramatic moment came on Wednesday morning when Sarah returned to school. Her suspension had been mysteriously overturned by the school district's central administration, with a formal letter of apology citing procedural errors in the original disciplinary action. More than that, she found herself escorted to a meeting with a new interim principal who wanted to discuss her experiences and ensure that proper support systems were in place. The new principal, Dr. Patricia Williams, was a retired military officer who'd transitioned into education administration with a reputation for turning around troubled schools. She'd been brought in by the state education department specifically to address the systematic issues that the federal review had uncovered at Jefferson High. Her first priority was meeting with students who'd been victims of the discriminatory practices that were now under investigation. Sarah walked through the halls of Jefferson High with a strange feeling of disconnection from the environment that had tormented her for so long. Students who'd previously ignored her or participated in her harassment now watched her with a mixture of curiosity and respect. Word had somehow spread that she was connected to the mysterious events that were reshaping their school's power structure, though no one understood exactly how or why. Madison was nowhere to be seen. She'd been enrolled in a private school in the next county where her parents hoped to rebuild her damaged reputation away from the scrutiny that had descended on Jefferson High. Jake had been expelled for the drug violations, his football scholarship opportunities evaporating along with his social status. Ashley was now attending therapy sessions mandated by her parents, who'd decided that their daughter's cruel behavior required professional intervention. During lunch that day, Sarah received a message to meet someone in the school library. She found Chief Rodriguez waiting for her in a quiet corner, dressed in a simple business suit that made him look like any other professional visiting the school. He'd come to check on her transition back to the school environment and to provide an update on the broader situation. The operation had been even more successful than they'd initially planned. The federal investigations were real and would continue regardless of their involvement, ensuring that the systematic problems at Jefferson High would be permanently addressed. Robert Cole's business was facing genuine scrutiny that would force him to operate more ethically or face serious consequences. Cole had lost most of her social influence and was focusing on damage control rather than attacking other families. Most importantly, Madison had learned that there were consequences to her actions that went far beyond anything her parents' money could fix. She was attending counseling sessions to address her behavioral problems, and had been quietly enrolled in community service programs designed to teach empathy and responsibility. Her parents, shocked by the revelations about her secret activities, had implemented strict supervision that would prevent any return to her previous patterns of behavior. Chief Rodriguez explained that this outcome had required minimal actual intervention from his team. Most of what had happened was simply the result of bringing existing problems into the light and ensuring that proper authorities had the information they needed to do their jobs. The bullies had been destroyed, not through revenge or vigilante justice, but through the application of legitimate oversight and accountability that had been missing from the system. Sarah understood that she'd witnessed something extraordinary. A demonstration of what real power looked like when wielded by people who understood duty, honor, and justice. Her father's old teammates hadn't needed to break any laws or engage in illegal activities. They'd simply used their knowledge, connections, and resources to ensure that the truth came out and that proper authorities could do their jobs without interference. But the most important lesson was about the nature of strength itself. Madison and her family had confused wealth with power, influence with authority, and intimidation with leadership. They'd built their dominance on the assumption that others would remain isolated and helpless, never imagining that their victims might have allies with real capabilities and unshakable principles. As Sarah prepared to leave the library, Chief Rodriguez handed her a small card with nothing but a phone number on it. He explained that his team would be moving on to other missions, but that certain obligations never expired. If she ever found herself in a situation where civilian authorities couldn't or wouldn't help, she should remember that she was part of a family that extended far beyond blood relations. Sarah walked home that afternoon through a town that looked the same but felt completely different. The oppressive atmosphere of fear and helplessness that had dominated her life for months was gone, replaced by something she'd almost forgotten existed: hope. She'd learned that being underestimated could be an advantage, that true strength came from having the right principles and the right allies, and that justice was possible even when the system seemed rigged against you. That evening, she called her father to tell him about her day and to thank him for the phone calls he'd made. He listened quietly, then reminded her that what she'd experienced wasn't special treatment or favoritism. It was simply what happened when good people looked out for each other. He'd earned the loyalty of his teammates through years of faithful service and sacrifice, and that loyalty extended to his family because that's what honor meant in the military community. Tommy came home from school that day with a smile Sarah hadn't seen in months. The bullies who'd been targeting him had suddenly lost interest in harassment, apparently too worried about their own problems to bother with picking on younger kids. He'd been able to eat lunch in peace, participate in class without fear, and even make some new friends who were no longer afraid to associate with the Martinez family. The transformation was complete, but Sarah understood that it came with responsibilities. She'd been given a demonstration of what was possible when people with real capabilities decided to intervene on behalf of justice. Now she had to decide what to do with the knowledge and connections she'd gained. The power to protect others was also the responsibility to use that power wisely and ethically, something she would carry with her for the rest of her life. 3 months later, Sarah Martinez stood at the podium in the Jefferson High School auditorium, delivering her valedictorian speech to a packed audience. The transformation of both her circumstances and the school itself had been so complete that many people struggled to remember how different things had been just a semester earlier. The federal investigations had resulted in a complete overhaul of the school's administration and policies, creating an environment where academic achievement and character were valued over social status and family wealth. Dr. Williams had proven to be exactly the kind of leader the school needed. Under her guidance, Jefferson High had implemented comprehensive anti-bullying programs, merit-based recognition systems, and support structures for students from military and working-class families. The toxic social hierarchy that had dominated the school for years had been dismantled and replaced with a culture that celebrated diversity, academic excellence, and mutual respect. Sarah's speech focused on themes of perseverance, justice, and the power of standing up for what's right, even when the odds seem impossible. She spoke about the importance of looking beyond surface appearances, of recognizing that true strength often comes in unexpected packages, and of understanding that everyone has potential that shouldn't be dismissed based on economic circumstances or social prejudices. In the audience, her father sat in his best uniform, the medals on his chest catching the auditorium lights. Beside him, her mother dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, overwhelmed with pride at how her daughter had not only survived her ordeal, but emerged stronger and more determined than ever. Tommy sat with them, now a confident sophomore, who'd become a leader among his peers, organizing art programs and peer counseling initiatives that helped other students facing difficulties. Also in the audience, scattered throughout the crowd in civilian clothes, were Chief Rodriguez and several of his teammates. They'd made a point of attending Sarah's graduation, not because they sought recognition for their role in her story, but because they understood that witnessing her success was part of completing the mission they'd undertaken. They'd intervened to protect a fellow warrior's family, and seeing Sarah thrive was confirmation that their efforts had achieved lasting positive change. The story of what had happened at Jefferson High School had become legendary in certain military circles, though the details were never discussed publicly. It served as a reminder of why the bonds between service members extended beyond their time in uniform, and why protecting each other's families was considered a sacred duty. Sarah had become a symbol of what was possible when good people refused to abandon each other in times of crisis. Madison Cole was notably absent from the graduation ceremony. She'd completed her senior year at the private academy where her parents had enrolled her, but her academic performance had suffered dramatically under the stress of her family's ongoing problems. Her father's business had been forced into bankruptcy after the military contract investigations revealed numerous ethical violations, and the family had been forced to sell their house and move to a smaller town where they could rebuild their lives away from the wreckage of their former reputation. The experience had fundamentally changed Madison's perspective on life and her relationships with others. The therapy sessions mandated by her parents had helped her understand the psychological damage she'd inflicted on her victims, and she'd begun a long process of making amends for her past behavior. She'd written lengthy apology letters to Sarah and Tommy, acknowledging the cruelty of her actions and expressing genuine remorse for the pain she'd caused. Sarah had chosen to respond to Madison's letter with grace and forgiveness, understanding that holding on to anger would only poison her own future. She'd written back encouraging Madison to use her experiences to become a better person and to prevent others from making the same mistakes. It was a response that demonstrated the kind of character and maturity that impressed everyone who knew the full story of what had transpired. Jake had enlisted in the Army after graduating from his alternative school program, hoping to find the discipline and purpose that had been missing from his privileged upbringing. The military environment was teaching him the difference between real strength and the bullying behavior that had defined his teenage years. His drill sergeants were unimpressed by his former status as a high school football star and were systematically breaking down his entitled attitudes while building genuine confidence and competence. Ashley had undergone perhaps the most dramatic transformation of all the former bullies. The shock of having her cruel online behavior exposed to her parents had triggered a complete reevaluation of her values and goals. She'd become involved in anti-cyberbullying campaigns and was planning to study social work in college, hoping to help other teenagers who were struggling with the kind of toxic social dynamics that had once consumed her own life. Principal Harrison had been forced into early retirement after the federal investigation revealed the full extent of his administrative failures and ethical violations. He'd spent the months since his departure in therapy and community service, trying to come to terms with how his cowardice and poor judgment had enabled years of systematic abuse. The experience had taught him painful lessons about leadership and moral responsibility that he wished he'd learned decades earlier. As Sarah concluded her valedictorian speech, she made a point of acknowledging the teachers and staff members who'd supported her throughout her academic career, particularly those who'd continued to believe in her potential even during her darkest moments. She also thanked her family for their unwavering support and for teaching her the values that had sustained her through adversity. She didn't mention the military intervention that had changed everything, understanding that some stories were meant to remain private. After the ceremony, Sarah was approached by dozens of classmates, teachers, and community members who wanted to congratulate her on her achievements and share their own stories of overcoming obstacles. Many of them confided that her example had inspired them to stand up against injustice in their own lives, creating ripple effects of positive change throughout the community. Chief Rodriguez found her during the reception that followed the graduation ceremony. He congratulated her on her academic success and her college scholarship, but more importantly, he wanted to discuss her future plans and the opportunities that might be available to someone with her unique combination of intelligence, character, and proven resilience under pressure. Sarah had been accepted to several prestigious universities, but she'd chosen to attend a military academy where she could pursue her interest in engineering while also developing the leadership skills that would allow her to serve her country. The experiences of the past year had shown her that some problems required people with both technical expertise and the moral courage to take action when civilian authorities were insufficient or compromised. The conversation with Chief Rodriguez revealed that her choice of schools had not gone unnoticed by certain elements within the military community. There were programs and opportunities available to cadets who demonstrated exceptional potential, pathways that could lead to specialized training and assignments that few people ever learned about. Sarah's proven ability to remain calm under pressure, her academic excellence, and her family's military connections made her an ideal candidate for consideration. But Chief Rodriguez also warned her about the responsibilities that came with such opportunities. The people who'd intervened on her behalf weren't just military personnel. They were part of an informal network of current and former service members who took care of problems that couldn't be handled through normal channels. Joining that community would mean accepting obligations that lasted a lifetime, commitments to protect others the way she'd been protected. Sarah didn't hesitate to express her interest in learning more about these opportunities. The past year had taught her that knowledge was power, that having the right allies was crucial, and that some battles required warriors rather than diplomats. She'd seen what was possible when good people with real capabilities decided to intervene on behalf of justice, and she wanted to be part of ensuring that such protection was available to others who might need it. Tommy approached as her conversation with Chief Rodriguez was concluding, and she introduced him to the man who'd played such a crucial role in transforming their lives. Tommy thanked him with the kind of mature gratitude that showed how much he'd grown over the past few months. And Chief Rodriguez responded with the respect that one warrior gives to another, regardless of age. As the graduation reception wound down, Sarah's family gathered for photos in front of the school that had once been a place of torment, but was now a symbol of triumph. Her father had tears in his eyes as he looked at his daughter in her cap and gown, understanding better than anyone else what her achievement represented. She'd not only survived her ordeal, but had emerged stronger, more confident, and more determined to make a positive difference in the world. The local newspaper wanted to do a feature story about Sarah's academic success and her plans for the future, but she politely declined most of their questions about the dramatic changes at Jefferson High School over the past year. When pressed about how she'd overcome the bullying that many people knew she'd faced, she simply said that she'd learned the importance of having good friends and staying true to her principles. Later that evening, Sarah sat in her room packing for a summer program at her chosen military academy, carefully folding the clothes and arranging the books that would accompany her to the next phase of her life. On her desk was the business card that Chief Rodriguez had given her months earlier, along with a new card he'd provided that day with additional contact information for people who could help her navigate the opportunities and challenges ahead. She also had a letter from Madison that had arrived just days before graduation, containing not just another apology, but also a warning about other bullying situations that Madison had become aware of in her new school. The letter asked if Sarah knew of any resources that might be able to help students who were facing the kind of systematic harassment that both of them now understood was more common than most people realized. Sarah smiled as she read Madison's letter, understanding that her former tormentor was beginning to grasp the true meaning of strength and responsibility. She made a mental note to pass the information along to Chief Rodriguez, knowing that his network of dedicated professionals would investigate the situation and take appropriate action if intervention was warranted. As she prepared for bed that night, Sarah reflected on everything that had changed in her life over the past year. She'd learned that being dismissed as worth nothing by people who confused wealth with power was actually a form of protection, allowing her to build strength and develop capabilities without attracting unwanted attention. She'd discovered that true strength came not from money or social status, but from having the right principles and the right allies. Most importantly, she'd learned that nobody fights alone if they're part of the right community. The bonds between military families extended across generations and geographic boundaries, creating networks of mutual support that were invisible to outsiders but absolutely reliable when needed. She was no longer just Sarah Martinez, the poor kid from a struggling military family. She was part of something larger and more powerful than any high school social hierarchy. The phone rang as she was turning off her light, and she answered to hear Chief Rodriguez's voice one final time before she left for her summer program. He'd called to remind her that her father's old teammates would be watching her progress with interest, ready to provide guidance and support as she navigated the challenges ahead. But he also wanted to emphasize that her success was ultimately her own achievement, earned through her own character and determination. Sarah thanked him for everything his team had done for her family, but Chief Rodriguez interrupted to correct her understanding of the situation. They hadn't done anything for her. They'd simply ensured that she had the opportunity to show the world what she was really capable of achieving. The bullies had been removed, not through revenge, but through accountability, and everything that followed had been the result of her own hard work and natural abilities. As she hung up the phone and settled into sleep, Sarah understood that she was entering a new phase of her life with advantages that most people never possessed. She had academic scholarships, military connections, and access to opportunities that could lead anywhere she chose to go. But more than that, she had the knowledge that there were people in the world who stood ready to protect the innocent and ensure that justice prevailed even when the system failed. The girl who'd been mocked as worth nothing had become someone whose potential was recognized by some of the most capable people in the country. She'd survived her trial by fire and emerged not just intact, but transformed into exactly the kind of person her tormentors had never suspected she could become. And this was only the beginning of her story.